Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the American Muslim Hour. I am Asima Kachun. Today we are speaking with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf about women in Islam. Welcome, Hamza Yusuf. Let's start off a little bit about the history of the Sharia and the role of women in that. In the 7th century Arabia, the Sharia or Islamic law was established to protect women's rights in the fields of freedom of belief, property, lineage, and honor, for example. If that was its purpose, why today is Islam seen as oppressive to women?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would say first and foremost that the Sharia is not something that came in the 7th century. The principles upon which the Sharia is based came in the 7th century, but the actual sacred law of Islam is a human endeavor. It took about 300 years to formulate, and much of it is based on humans' attempt at understanding revelation. And so you have always, when you're dealing with religious tradition, you are dealing with human attempts at understanding God's intent through a book or a revelation, like the Christians attempting to understand what God intended for them through the Bible. The Muslims have the same historical situation in attempting to understand what God intended for them through the Quran. So the actual laws that were given to the Prophet ﷺ in the 7th century there are not that many, and a lot of Muslims are unaware of that. The majority of the legal verses in the Quran, of which there are only about 500 out of 6,000, over 6,600 verses in the Quran, only about 500 deal with legal situations. And most of them deal with it in a way that enables situational law. In other words, that in different situations, different laws are applied. So there's aims and purposes behind law. So you have an example of, in Islamic law, if somebody steals, then their hand is cut off. Now, people think that that sounds barbaric, but the reality of it is that law only applies with certain types of theft. It doesn't apply for theft that occurred because things were left out. It's somebody breaking, what we would call in this culture breaking and entering, and stealing from a protected area. And then it's only under certain situations. So Umar ibn al-Khattab, who's the second caliph of Islam, he suspended that law during a drought and a famine period, because he said people were forced to steal in order to feed their families. And therefore the aim and purpose of the law was no longer being served in applying the law. So Islamic law is not some kind of simpleton's law of how to run a society in the 7th century and try to apply that in the 21st century. It's a very complex and sophisticated legal system, and it's based on rigorous principles that were laid down in the Quran, and there are certain legal issues that deal with women's rights, and at the time they were considered extremely radical. Now, in this quote-unquote enlightened period of time, the Christians didn't give property rights to their women until the 19th century. And that's a historical fact. In England, the women were constantly deprived of property and wealth, because even second or third born sons, because in the English legal system in the 19th century, it was the firstborn who inherited all the property of the, and from an Islamic point of view, that's unjust. So in Islam, 1400 years ago, women were given inheritance laws. And people say, well, what about a woman who only inherits half? Because the Quran says that a male gets twice as much as a female. That was specifically in one instant. There are other inheritance instances where women inherit and male relatives don't, or women actually get more than the men. But in one specific instance, which is when there's a son and a daughter. That would be a case where the son took twice as much as the daughter, and the reason for that, the wisdom behind it, is that a woman's wealth in Islam is discretionary. Her wealth, she can use it in whatever way she wants, whereas a man's wealth is there's responsibilities related to it. He has to support his parents if they're old and unable to support themselves. He has to support any female relatives that don't have male support. He has responsibilities, and that was always understood by the scholars of Islam. They never saw it as men are twice as good as women or deserve twice as much. They saw it as a burden, that it was actually a burden. So I think part of the problem is that because there's so much ignorance, not just amongst the Muslims, but certainly amongst the non-Muslims, but the Muslims themselves are ignorant about Islamic law.
Where in history do you suppose that the laws of the Sharia were abrogated in order to convince Muslim women that Islam was oppressive to them, and this abuse of Islam then encouraged in favor of men?
First, I would say that I don't think anywhere have the laws of Islam been abrogated. I would rephrase that by saying that there are certainly very early on the laws of Islam were no longer being applied. In terms of women, I don't think women have ever been convinced that Islam is repressive for them, but I think that they have, in many Muslim countries, the way that Islam has expressed culturally itself is not dissimilar to the way that Christianity was expressed in the West for many centuries, basically patriarchal, with an idea of a certain hierarchy and a position of women in society. And I think what's difficult for people in the West to realize is that this quote-unquote women's liberation is a very recent phenomenon. And so when they look at the Muslim world, they're looking at a world that is not dissimilar to their own world not that long ago. But these traditions are still maintained, and they're human traditions. Whether Islam agrees with that or not is a matter of looking into what Islam says about the specific situation.
I see. And why do you suppose that that happens?
Well, I think that by the nature of relationships, power is an element in any human relationship. If you work in a corporation, you are in a power relationship with the people you work with. Your boss has certain power over you. One of the things that drives people crazy in corporations is watching people kiss up to the boss. Why do they do that? Why do they treat the boss with respect and they don't treat their fellow coworkers with that same respect? Because there's a power relationship involved here. And I think that marriage, it's very easy to slip into power relationships that are dysfunctional, that are pathological, that are not healthy, but we're human beings, and we do have certain elements in our personalities and our nature. You're dealing with biology. Males are a more aggressive branch of the human family.